Right, well, we're going to be looking at nonconformist chapels in the Brightwater district. They're a class of building that I don't think have really been appreciated as much as they should have been. Starting off with a very nice little village chapel. This is Horton-le-Skerne on the outskirts of Darlington. The original early 19th century chapel on the right, and then a close copy, a schoolroom out of maybe 100 years later on the left. So to look at chapels, I've done quite a bit of work surveying chapels and done quite a few sort of quick surveys on large areas. How you do it? Well, checking through old trade directories is a good thing. That usually tells you what chapels were there, when they were founded, often how much they cost and how many they seated. Then old ordnance survey maps give a good impression. And if you get one of the large-scale pound plans from the 1850s, public buildings, which chapels were, you get an actual ground plan. On this picture, you can see the Presbyterian chapel in Newcastle. There's actually a useful plan showing the interior of the building. Then checking whether the chapel's there today. Well, Google Earth's a good starter, but usually you have to make a field visit. I've been looking at so many chapels, I haven't had a chance to go inside very many. It's simply driving around, checking if they're still there, and taking exterior pictures. I've done more detailed surveys of chapels in the Pennine AONB and in Darlington, and in those cases, I've managed to make measured drawings of a few buildings, but generally this has been a rapid survey, just looking at the outsides. A bit of history, because we need history to set the chapels in their context, I think. And chapels they reflect dissent, nonconformity, the desire of people to worship without the strictures of a state church. This all began rather messily in the 16th century with the Reformation. That's when the Church of England split away from Rome and stayed split. In the 17th century, with the Civil War, things loosened up and a whole series of new groups were founded, like the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Society of Friends, who everyone called Quakers. They're founded by George Fox. And after the return of the monarchy, these churches were tolerated but only just. They managed to survive. The 18th century, the great figure is John Wesley, who founded the Methodists, although he always claimed to remain an Anglican. And then also, at the end of the 18th century, came the primitive Methodists, who were really a reforming movement within Methodism. And there were several more of those in the 19th century. Quite distinctive with the Salvation Army. Then later on still came Pentecostals, and in the 20th century, house churches, although they don't have their own distinctive buildings really. So that's, in a nutshell, a very complicated history. So the old dissent, which is the title we use for groups who came out around the time of the Civil War in the 17th century, had relatively few buildings. They were the earliest wave. There were groups like the Society of Friends I've mentioned, the Baptists and the Independents, who later became the Congregationists and the Presbyterians. George Fox, a bit like Wesley, was a very powerful open-air preacher, and the Quakers were actually pretty radical and anti-establishment group, more so than the later nonconformists. Their meeting houses would never be called a church or a chapel. They were always a meeting house. There's a beautiful example at Conewood in Northumberland surviving. Very plain, very simple, just austerity really. A distinctive group, they were never very large. And then by far the largest part of nonconformity came from the mission of John Wesley, born in 1703. He had an experience where famously he described his heart as strangely warmed in 1738. I actually went to America as a missionary and wasn't very successful there. But then he came back to England and used to rode the length and breadth of the country on his horse. In 1747, he first came to Blanchland. Then later on, he and his friends were in Allendale, and things really started to happen. There was revival. A lot of people got involved, and Methodist classes, they were called, were formed. Although at this period, Wesley still insisted he was part of the Church of England. Then there was a second wave of Methodism that separated from their parent Wesleyanism. This is after Wesley's death. He died in the 1790s. And by 1810, Wesleyanism was becoming respectable, which happens to all these groups. And their groups were itching to get back to how they originally were. And the primitive Methodists were locally known as the Ranters, a bit like the Society of Friends were popular as the Quakers. The primitive Methodists, because they preached in the streets, were known as the Ranters. And they had two founders, Hugh Bourne and William Clowes. They remained working class and they went into open air, what they called camp meetings. Camp meetings began in America and were sort of imported back to Britain in the early 19th century. And their chapels were very basic preaching boxes. But later on, actually, they became more likely to call their buildings churches than the original Wesleyan Methodists. And they had great success with lead mining communities in the Pennines. And this is a little chapel at Forest in Teesdale. Now, in Darlington, within the Brightwater survey area, I've come across a terminized round total of 50, taking 1914 as a cut-off date, so everything changed with the First World War. I found 50 chapels, only a handful of which are still in use. But there's a map showing them, mostly clustered around the town centre. But then as sort of new housing areas were built, the different denominations would usually send out a chapel into those. But let's say the main cluster is in the town centre. As you can see there, the various groups: Society of Friends, the earliest, then Presbyterian, Congregationalist, and Baptist, then the great wave in the late 18th century of Methodism, and Salvation Army, and then a few other groups. On the outskirts of Darlington, in Cockerton, one of the smaller groups of Methodism, or they call it the United Free Methodists. They weren't very large. And there's a nice little chapel, now a house, built in 1879, in use until 1932. And it's a very plain building. It's a preaching box. These chapels were built so people could hear the word. Preaching was all important. The pulpit was central, unlike the altar in an Anglican church where the sacrament was more important. And across the green in Cockerton, much grander, is the Wesleyan, another branch of Methodism, or the mainstream branch of Methodism, the Wesleyan chapel. This one, the original was 1832, replaced by this one in 1875. It was so grand, it was nicknamed Cockerton Cathedral. There was clearly a wealthy congregation, and Ross and Lamb were the architects. And very interestingly, between the two doors is this descending dragon, which is rather nice. So they're going in for Gothic detail, and this is really a desire for status. We have the grandest chapel in the area. So by the 1870s, Methodism had certainly become thoroughly acceptable and had come of age, really. Much simpler. This is one of the ones you find on the OS map. It's still in use as Harrogate Hill Christian Fellowship, but a very plain mission hall. It appears on maps as a mission hall, difficult to trace which actual nonconformist groups used it, but there were always the main groups, the Wesleyans, Primitive Methodists, Baptists, etc., and then a number of independent local little nonconformist churches which would have used a very plain building like this. This is Crosby Street Mission Hall at the north end of Darlington. Another one, a Wesleyan chapel of 1863, which actually wasn't used for very long. That's the building on the right. It's now Darlington Spiritualist Church and has been much altered. Well, it's much altered now. It hardly looks like a church at all. And the more architectural building on the left is a schoolroom built 20 years after the chapel in 1883. And the schoolroom has dated foundation stones. People were encouraged to give money. They have their names carved on a foundation stone. And so here we can just about read the name of Henry Bell Pease, Esquire, 1883, obviously a donor. To say by then Methodism was certainly very respectable. Here's a Harrogate Hill Wesleyan Church, 1902. Again, Gothic. They've now taken on the Gothic style associated with the Church of England, and really quite a grand building, calling itself a church rather than a chapel. Here's one we saw earlier. This is the rather nice little village chapel in Halton-Liskearn. The chapel itself on the right, classical. They haven't got the Gothic yet. This is 1825, one of the earlier ones, only 30 years after Wesley's death. And then with a 1900 schoolroom built on to the right. Here's Halton Road Albert Hill Mission, primitive Methodist, and they're Gothic. They seem to go Gothic rather more enthusiastically than the Wesleyans. Nice building of 1870, converted to a house in 1990. Early house conversions, people seemed keen to make the building look as unlike a chapel as possible. But then by the late 1900s, people were keen to maintain at least the external appearance of the building. Here's one nearby Nestfield, another United Methodist Free Church, 1867. Quite a pretentious building, but had already been much altered, was disused perhaps in the 1950s, and has now been demolished. Another interesting building in Darlington, Springfield. This sadly has gone now. This was a Presbyterian building, and it was a prefabricated church. It was originally came from Robert Stevenson's Newcastle factory, who supported the establishment of the Presbyterian Church in Darlington. And actually, their canteen, a wooden and cast iron canteen building, was brought here from Newcastle to be reused as a church in 1907. It was sadly pulled down a couple of years ago. The Salvation Army took it over and built a new building on the site. Hyington, coming out into the villages now. Here's a nice Wesleyan chapel, and the Wesleyans say are there after the middle of the 19th century. They're going Gothic for prestige, and quite a nice simple Gothic building, 1872. Now Redworth nearby, similar date, 1878, but stayed very, very simple. Wesleyan chapel of the simplest type, tiny little building. I suspect originally the front door was in the middle of that street elevation, underneath the stone that says Wesleyan Chapel, 1878. What's one of the most basics, would have seated about 20 or 30. Now in Shildon, there are several chapels, but with the Brightwater survey area being what it is, it only actually includes one chapel. That's an important one. That's a big Wesleyan chapel, what I call a town chapel, quite a contrast to the village one in Redworth, 1865, but they put galleries in about 10 years later. And here, they haven't quite gone Gothic, it's 1860s. By the 1870s, 1880s, they've gone Gothic. But here's one of the later classical ones. You can see an open pedimented gable, sort of Italian detail. Quite a nice building, for sale as often. Then in Bradbury, 1895 Wesleyan Chapel, brick, side on, with the entrance in the middle of the side elevation. Once you're inside, I suspect the pulpit would be facing the doorway on the other side. The pulpit was always the liturgical focus, the central thing to draw your eye, emphasizing the dominance of the word, the spoken word, of the read word from the Bible, and interpreted word over the sacrament. Morden nearby, very simple, Wesleyan cottage. It was originally a pair of cottages and has returned to being a little more than a cottage. So nothing very distinctively chapel about that in appearance now. That was the Wesleyan chapel of 1880. Sadburge, again, a simple little brick building, a little bit more architectural. Again, a house now, simply called the chapel. A lot of villages have a house, the chapel or the old chapel. Welsh slate roof, again showing that it came after the railways. Sedgefield, a rather grander Wesleyan chapel, 1856, still classical, with those sort of corbels to the recessed panels of the side walls, and an entrance in the end bay. So the pulpit would have been in the centre at the left-hand end here. It's fairly grand. And things you find in and around chapels, some distinctive things. The primitive Methodists were very much early on into open air worship, into what they call camp meetings, which was a tradition that came across from the States actually quite early. And they were into sharing a common cup, and it simply contained water. That's the teetotalism came in with the primitive Methodists. The Wesleyans weren't teetotal. In fact, there was quite a bit of controversy between the different brands of Methodism over whether you should drink alcohol or not. But the primitives were certainly into teetotalism, into total abstention. And here is a loving cup, a common cup used at camp meetings. This is in the Weirhead Chapel. Then there's a collecting box, that was important, and also a collecting shovel on a long handle. So it could be somebody would come down the aisle and push this in front of you. You took up the collection. Again, an important ritual part of the service. Evidences of chapels. You get things, people are always got buried there. Here we are at Lanehead in Weardale, and there's a plaque in loving memory of the first member and official of this church, Emerson Humble. Then Fanny Peart, a notable member, this is a primitive Methodist chapel, who kept open house for primitive Methodist preachers that had been travelling around for over 50 years. Jonathan Humble, who was a member and for 45 years, trustee, leader, and local preacher. Then J. Oliver Humble was simply a faithful member. And then again, they were very much into issuing commemorative, what were we called? Not really a plaque, a poster. And this is from 1907 from High House, primitive Methodists again. And there are the two founders of primitive Methodism. The images, almost icons really, on this nice plaque with columns on either side, an illustration of chapels below. So they're primitive by 1907. That's 100 years of primitive Methodism, and they're getting quite conscious of their history and quite keen on promoting it. Other things, top left, Bowleys in Teesdale, a fragment reused from an older primitive Methodist chapel, reused as angle coin, so real archaeology here, reused stones. Then another foundation stone, its donor's name, Mrs. Pumphrey. It's a name, if you know, from the vet books. There was a famous Mrs. Pumphrey. Then a find I made in the former primitive Methodist chapel in Back Street, Hexham. The building had been much altered, but you could see traces of colour through the distemper on one wall. And I got a brush and a bucket of water and revealed this glorious glowing lettering of a text: "Be ye doers of the word, not hearers only." It's an ideal text you put above the pulpit for the congregation to read, learn, and inwardly digest. And that was really quite nice. So a lot of the chapels would go into painted texts on the walls. The word was all important, not images, but words. And also occasionally, and this is a bit more puzzling, I worry for this building. There's plans to demolish it. This is a building in Stockton-on-Tees, primitive Methodist chapel. It is an unlisted building. It's in the middle of a rather boring row of Georgian houses. It's the one building that isn't listed. It really should be listed. 1860s primitive chapel, quite grand Gothic, and it's covered in dragons. Now, what the primitives were doing, Wesleyans would never have dragons, but the primitives, who were more working class and said they preferred things as church, were quite into things like this. And you've got this lovely building. It's latterly, it was a painted wallpaper sale, I think, and the whole building's been daubed over. It was polychrome brickwork, coloured sort of yellow and orange brick, a really quite architectural building, set with stone dressings and these wonderful dragons. And I fear for it. I'm not quite sure whether it's still with us. It ought to be, but I say people don't rate chapels as important, which is sad. And then the ultimate faith, one that isn't with us. I used to drive this frequently on the A68 at Toft Hill, a great big box of a place. Toft Hill, Primitive Methodist Chapel. There was a Wesleyan Methodist Chapel just round the corner where I suspect the congregation went to the end. And as usual, it stood derelict for 20 years or so. And you could peer through the window and see the inside. They'd ripped the galleries out. So it had been stripped out inside. Big building, would have seated 600 or 700 in its heyday, and had a thriving Primitive Methodist congregation. It wasn't listed. It got demolished. And sadly, and I went past one day, and it was gone. The demolition men were there. It was gone. Built in the sidewall was this stone from an older chapel, Primitive Methodist Chapel, erected 1829. The other one was 1870s, I think. Enlarged AD 1840 and 1860. So that's built, 10 years after it's built, they have to enlarge it. Then 20 years later, they enlarged it again. It shows that they call it the society at first, the congregation, was growing rapidly in the mid-19th century. And there's a very famous text, "Hitherto hath the Lord helped us." And this was built into the sidewall of the 1870s chapel. And they were putting it down, and I asked the workman what they were going to do. Oh, would I like to buy it? No, I didn't want to buy it. It needs to stay on site. It needs to be built in the wall on site. Oh, no. Well, can we sell it to somebody? I mean, that stone, there's 2 houses on site now. That stone should have stayed. I don't know what happened to it. But as I say, people don't take the notice they should of chapels.